Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.
And hello again, everyone, and thanks very much for being with us. As more than one observer put it, there simply was not another story this week. A draft opinion leaked from the U.S. Supreme Court, reversing a half-century precedent that guaranteed a right to abortion. Now, that decision, if formally adopted by the court, would essentially end abortion in Arkansas. Ours is among more than a dozen states with a so-called trigger law, which makes the abortion ban effective upon the reversal of the U.S. Supreme Court's Roe decision. Interviewed earlier this week on the PBS NewsHour, Arkansas Attorney General Leslie Rutledge.
We put a law in place in 2019 that we are essentially calling a trigger law, which will go into effect in the event that the court does, in fact, overturn Roe v. Wade in the Casey decision. The trigger law essentially says that in Arkansas, as the Attorney General for the state, I will certify that that is what the Supreme Court of the United States has done, is overturned Roe v. Wade and Casey, which would allow us to have a total ban on abortions in effect, a total ban except to save the life of a mother in a medical emergency.
And here with us now to consider the reversal of Roe, the likely reversal of Roe, and the subsequent Casey ruling, which tinkered with Roe for a little bit. Jerry Cox, president of the Family Council of Arkansas, and Karen Ricketts, president of the Arkansas Coalition for Reproductive Justice. Thank you both for coming in.
Thank you.
Mr. Cox, let me begin with you because, as they would say, perhaps having you being on the prevailing side, is there any doubt in your mind that abortion in Arkansas is effectively, pending, of course, formal adoption by the court, is at an end?
I agree, provided that this ruling or this report stands. We don't know for sure. We'll know probably between now and the end of June. But if it stands as written, then I agree with the Attorney General that our existing prohibitions on abortion would be enforceable. Therefore, abortion would be illegal in Arkansas except for the purpose of saving the life of the mother.
All right, Ms. Ricketts.
Yes, this is true. Currently, abortion is still legal in Arkansas, but if this draft were to be the final say from the Supreme Court, abortion in Arkansas would no longer be available, and there would be no exceptions for rape or incest. And Mr. Cox is correct that it would be available in cases of endangerment to the life of the mother. However, physicians are having a hard time deciding when is the right time to proceed with an abortion for that patient, because there is a risk in them losing their license.
There are, in fact, civil and criminal penalties, Mr. Cox, that are applicable to physicians who violate the statute, and it has been criticized for its vagueness, for its supposed vagueness.
Well, and Steve, it's also important to point out that the trigger law is not the only abortion law in Arkansas that would be enforceable if Roe is reversed. For example, in 2021, the Arkansas legislature passed another law that's not a trigger law. It just simply says that abortion is illegal in Arkansas except to save the life of the mother. Now, that law has been enjoined in federal court. But there's an argument to be made that if Roe goes away, if Casey goes away,
they're moot.
That those laws would be enforceable then at that point. Not only that, but there's also a question about pre-Roe legislation that prohibited abortions before Roe was ever instituted. Those laws were never repealed, and so there's lots of debate out there about how many moving parts there will be, but all of those moving parts point toward abortion being essentially illegal in Arkansas if Roe and Casey go away.
If Roe is sustained, or if the court's decision is sustained.
Correct.
What legislation do you anticipate next in Arkansas?
Well, I think nobody can answer that right now. I certainly am not qualified to answer it. Arkansas has among the strongest abortion laws in the country.
In fact, more than a dozen, I think.
Yeah, I mean, in fact, the legislature has passed 44 what we consider pro-life bills in the last 10 years. Now, many of these are regulating clinics, and many of these are in effect even right now. But
and have been sustained by the courts.
Absolutely. But point is, these other laws would be enforceable, and we'll have to wait and see. I think the legislature will pass whatever is necessary to advance the pro-life cause here in Arkansas, and they've already made it very clear. In fact, polling by the University of Arkansas indicates that 79% of the people in Arkansas support either an outright ban on abortion or regulation of it. Now, if Roe were to be the law of the land, Roe really opened it up where there were very little regulations on abortion, because it wasn't until 1992 with the Casey decision that you saw abortion being reined in. But prior to that, for about 20 years, it was kind of the Wild West with abortion. And so there are some people that want to take us back to that. We're not one of them.
All right, Ms. Ricketts, there would appear to be very little that the pro-choice forces, anyway, could muster in terms of legislation should Justice Alito's finding be sustained.
For sure. But I do want to take a moment and circle back to your question about criminalization laws. We are already seeing that in the United States. In Oklahoma, last year, there was a young woman who, after suffering a traumatic pregnancy loss, she was imprisoned during the pandemic for a year and a half and charged with manslaughter over something that was out of her control, with no basis of law or science. So this is something we're already seeing. And as far as the history of the anti-abortion movement, this is something that is not new. This is something we've been seeing building up for several decades. In the 1850s, that's when, I think you referenced it earlier, that was the beginning of the movement. It wasn't necessarily politicized at that time, but physicians wanted to kind of have more control over when an abortion could take place, and taking it out of the hands of the midwives and healers at that time. And then over the next several decades, we see the late 60s, 70s build up of states wanting to lower restrictions on the already restricted abortion bans at that time. And when Roe was passed in 73 and 76, about 3 years later, that's when you see more of the evangelical movement to have this as a platform, abortion rights in elections.
Yeah, the ascent of the religious right, to put it in shorthand anyway.
For sure, for
well,
sure.
Are you concerned about further legislative initiatives by social conservatives?
I'm concerned that with the argument that taking this out of the federal and Supreme Court's hands into states' rights, we've seen over the past decades the party of small government wishes to, or already uses methods such as gerrymandering, redlining, voter suppression laws to maintain that power. And so it would be very difficult to win elections, to have legislators who would pass and keep laws where abortion is accessible to everyone. And this isn't just a women's issue either. I'd like to clarify that abortion care is needed for trans men, for non-binary people, and it won't just stop here. I think the biggest concern leading past this is what's next. If it's abortion care, which is health care, what's going to be next? Access to birth control, same-sex and interracial marriages. So those are my concerns at the moment.
Well, I want to come back to that in just a moment. Jerry Cox, let me do that. You note there is no exception for rape or incest in the Arkansas statutes.
That is correct.
Has been the hang-up for a lot of people who might consider themselves moderates on the abortion issue. Why not an exception for rape?
Well,
incest.
This is a matter of people being better informed about the issue, because if you stop and think, we don't punish children for the crimes of their fathers. We just don't do that anywhere in our society. And yet that's what it's the equivalent of if you put an unborn child to death because of the circumstances under which it was conceived.
Well,
now,
are you punishing a woman, though,
but let
who
me,
was a victim
and let me finish with that.
for the crimes of her aggressor,
the
assailant?
Rape is awful. Incest is terrible. We have laws that need to deal with those people. And I wish I could I could only imagine the hurt that imposes on a woman to be a victim of rape or incest. And I would never, ever minimize that, and I couldn't even understand what that's like. But we operate from the position that the unborn child is a distinct person, has its own blood type, its own separate DNA. It has, at 6 weeks, it has a heartbeat, it has brain waves. We can see into the womb now. Back when Roe was instituted, Steve, I was in college at the time. I remember what it was like, where people said, oh, an unborn child, it's just a blob in the belly, it's like a tumor, there's nothing really to it. But then we began to have ultrasound, and now everybody shows a picture of their unborn child. You see its little face. We can do surgeries on unborn children, and so the idea of putting that person to death because of how it was conceived, it's not the solution. It's a terrible situation, but there's a better way. And that's what we really need to educate people on. And I think the legislature gets it because they passed that law.
Yeah, let me get to Ms. Ricketts on that.
For there not to be exemptions for rape or incest, it makes me wonder who these laws are actually protecting. Is it the pregnant person or is it the rapist? And so with that, the Mississippi case, if you're not aware, the one that's going against or up in front of the Supreme Court, would ban abortions past 15 weeks. And there are instances where fetal anomalies happen and a family may be faced with a decision to abort a fetus if something were to happen, and it would be a wanted pregnancy. And that just adds more complications to an already traumatic and touchy subject, right? And then the other thing is, without exemptions for rape or incest, it's implying a forced birth, which again has its own traumas of living with that experience, and then also it's a complicated, it's a touchy subject because these are very private matters that should be within that person's family or with their physician. And with abortion care,
Gather it if you want to, but let me go to
Mr. For sure.
Sure.
Well, let me go to Mr. Cox with a point that you have raised and that many others have raised, Mr. Cox, and that is in Justice Alito's writing. He dismissed the 14th Amendment argument by saying there is no, the Constitution is, as Mr. Scalia would, Justice Scalia would say, simply silent on the matter of a, quote, right to privacy. And from that right to privacy argument stems, as Ms. Ricketts noted, same-sex marriage, even contraception. Do you see social conservatives moving in that direction?
Absolutely
is that a
not.
legitimate fear?
It's not a legitimate fear. I realize it's a fear on the part of some people, but it's not legitimate because, I've reviewed the ruling, the document. It just doesn't mention any of those things even remotely. This is a ruling talking about abortion. Here's what I found interesting when I was going through this. This document says that the Supreme Court has
Got
tried...
about a minute remaining.
Supreme Court's tried for 50 years to settle the issue of abortion and has been unable to do so. So what they said is, we're going to send this back to the states and let you guys work this out because we can't solve it. And the fact that the two of us are here on totally opposite sides of the issue is just a microcosm of the debate that's going on around the country. And the court said, we've issued ruling after ruling and it hasn't settled it. We're going to send it back to the states and let the elected officials work this out. To me, that's the fair way to do it.
I'll give Ms. Ricketts the last word.
For sure. I don't think it is a I don't trust that the legislators would do the right thing in ensuring everyone's access to
You don't have a choice,
abortion.
really, when it gets down to it.
True, especially when there are methods like gerrymandering and redlining and voter suppression laws that keep people in power. And to go back earlier, when Mr. Cox was talking about education, how is it pro-life when we don't have comprehensive age-appropriate sex education and education on different types of birth control and contraception? So I think if we are going to look at this in a pro-life stance, we would need to also tie in the education part of preventing abortion. So
I got to end it there because we're simply out of time. Please come back soon and we'll continue the conversation, if you will.
Steve.
For sure.
Ms. Ricketts, Mr. Cox, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
thank you.
And we'll be right back. And we are back. If you've been anywhere outside in Arkansas the past couple of days, you got wet. Rain, a lot of it, and not just this week, but since the turn of the year, and certainly since the arrival of spring. April showers may bring May flowers, but that rain is having a negative impact on row crops, especially, and ironically, a crop that requires a lot of water. It's a crop that customarily brings tens of millions of dollars to the state, but at this moment, its prospects are literally underwater. With us now to discuss the situation, Dr. Jarrod Hardke of the UA's Agriculture Division. Welcome back, Doctor. Man, it's wet out there.
Yes, it's been an extremely wet spring, so we're tracking along the lines of some of our slowest rice planting progress in a very long time. We were fortunate week before last to have a nice little jump in our planting progress, but really put us in line. I'm sure everybody remembers 2019 and 2020 being extremely wet years as well, and that really puts us right along the lines of the slowest progress in 30 years.
Yeah, I hope I didn't sound flip in bringing you on board, because we're talking literally here about millions of dollars, tens of millions of dollars in receipts.
Yes, absolutely.
That are in jeopardy. Yeah.
That's correct. And I mean, you make an excellent point. Rice is something that, anyone with any familiarity, we do grow with a lot of water, typically in a flooded environment, but it has to be dry for us to get it planted in the first place. And that's really given us an extreme amount of difficulty this year. Again, as you mentioned, more rain experience this week. We're very hopeful for the upcoming forecast of next week that it may finally turn drier and give us an opportunity. But it is getting to that point in the calendar year where growers have to make decisions on whether it continues to be a profitable decision this late in the year to continue how much rice to continue planting.
What's the cutoff point?
Well, depending on the year, unfortunately, is where it gets even more difficult. So the general topic, I know everybody's paying more for everything these days, and growers are no different.
No, in terms of planting, though, yeah, we'll come to that.
Yes. Really, the impact of fertilizer and fuel prices have made the economics of just production of our row crops this year that much more difficult. So their margins are much thinner, and that's where I was going is the idea of planting later in some years is still fairly profitable. But in a year like this, with the increased production cost, that margin of profitability is now smaller, so we don't have as much time as we approach toward the end of May. That's really going to be the end of it.
In effect, rice farmers then are fighting to, or having to deal with two dynamics: one, weather, and the other, the simple finances of getting a crop in.
That's correct.
And harvesting it later.
Yes, you're dealing with an interesting matrix there, and certainly, well, you just touched on it, the harvest. The later we plant, the later harvest is, and the greater chance of running into difficult harvest weather, more hurricane type weather that may impact harvest and profitability. So a lot of decisions going on right now, and certainly, again, not even just rice, but also with soybean and corn, and how we're going to have to connect those all together.
Sure, but let's stay with rice for just a second. I want to go to other row crops in a minute, but in terms, is there any way to calculate exactly where we are in that matrix right now? How much time have we got left? And
we really have about 2 weeks left before we're starting to trend down enough, generally speaking, in yield potential to where we're going to continue. But the economics of things have already, and the wet weather already have us, well below our projected acreage. That acres have already begun to shift to potentially other crops or to acres that may just go unplanted for the year.
Yeah.
As they get too late.
Stay with rice for just a second. What in a good year, in an average year, what was that crop worth to the state?
Well,
rice.
Well, that's difficult on the economic part, but acreage-wise, that portion of it, it's funny how it works for the past decade. In an even-numbered year, 1.4 to 1.5 million acres in the state are planted to rice. In our odd-numbered years, it's been around 1.2 million acres. So this year being an even-numbered year, we should be in the 1.4 to 1.5 million acres, and we're going to struggle to be much over 1 million acres this year, which is, again, that's potentially, depending on how you look at it, 300,000 to 500,000 acres reduced from where we should be. So beyond just the growers, the entire rice industry within the state of Arkansas, all the jobs that depend on that industry and that production that's expected to be there are going to be impacted.
Is there really an option other than to plant or not plant?
Plant something else, like potentially soybean. That's really what it's going to come down to.
There is time remaining then for other options and crop options.
Yes, but primarily just soybean. That's right. You have really kind of that one option remaining.
Now, we mentioned other row crops as well, corn, soybeans.
Yes, the upside of soybean is that we do have more time to still have an effective soybean crop. We're more on pace with soybean because we don't typically plant them as early. Corn, however, we do plant very early, and we're still well behind our typical progress. And these recent rains, we've really reached the end of the line for corn planting because yield potential is now, as of now, going down. So the rains this week will, for the most part, put an effective end to corn planting, and exactly how far our corn acres will fall as a result still remains to be seen, but could be a substantial reduction there as we've kind of run into the end of that due to the rainfall.
Commodity prices, outlook?
So far, very good. But again, we're expecting them to help us overcome the increased input costs. They have somewhat, but still don't look as profitable as a year ago, even with some of the highest commodity prices we've seen in a decade. They're still just barely attempting to keep up with those increased input costs.
Well, we have interest rates going up too.
Yes, add that layer to it. So that's a very fluid dynamic as well with just how much they're actually keeping up.
Our marketing capabilities, either domestic or overseas. Overseas are enormous markets for Arkansas crops.
Yes, and especially for rice.
How much disruption are you seeing out there?
Well, the greater concern there, if we don't hit our typical production levels of rice, then we have far-reaching implications on if we don't have the rice to supply those markets this year, they're going to get it from somewhere else. And once they move to those avenues, will we get those markets back?
Tough to get them back.
Yes, very much so.
Well, we demonstrated that with wheat a couple decades ago.
Yes, we have. So those are the kind of things that we can be flirting with upcoming that we're certainly trying to avoid and hopefully can get. Hate to bring luck into it, but that's unfortunately part of farming is get a little luck to get enough production out of this year and have a high yielding year to overcome some of our limitations.
The Arkansas farmer would have a lot, it would seem, at stake in foreign policy, particularly in Eurasia, say on the border between Russia and Ukraine.
Yes, we do in fact have a lot at stake with that, with where we export, and certainly we've been trying for years to improve further exports to Asia and related areas, particularly with rice, but we do have a lot impacted by those.
Well, and fertilizer too.
Absolutely.
It's multifaceted. There's so many components, foreign policy components in Arkansas agriculture.
Yes, we need things to buy from them and we need things to sell to them. And so it is working both directions. And if one starts to get out of line, it has dramatic impacts to square the deal.
Yeah, and a bit, well, in this hemisphere anyway, Arkansas agriculture has been at odds for a long time, so to speak, certainly from the Farm Bureau's position with U.S. policy toward Cuba. That remains a point of contention.
Yes, it does. It does remain a point of contention. Yeah. It's a great. There's a big rice market there.
Yeah.
That has the potential. Hopefully, someday down the road, that can be worked out.
Do you see any movement at all on that? I mean, Washington has a lot of things on its collective mind right now, and U.S. trade relations with Cuba don't seem to be very near the top.
Certainly with what's been going on the past few years, there hasn't been a lot of conversation that I've heard about it as everything else has risen to the top.
Yeah. What if you had, I mean, let me end it this way. If you had, well, you do, in fact, we were chatting, you've got a son and a daughter. You want them to go into agriculture someday?
Absolutely. That's one of my greatest concerns as we continue to have a declining population in agriculture. I was raised on a family farm.
Sure.
I still live on that family farm. My kids love it, and I hope they stay involved and want to be involved in it. And we're always looking and encouraging others to keep people involved and know where their food comes from and how it's produced. And wonderful opportunities in the state of Arkansas to see just how efficiently and sustainably we produce all of these crops and commodities. And again, not even just the major ones we've talked about, but others. Arkansas is a wonderful place to see how we can produce a wide range of everything.
Even with its challenges.
That's right, even with its challenges. But as we do have a tendency to say within the Division of Agriculture, you know, there is job security. There's always something going on, some issue that there is to deal with, and that's where we want to be, is helping growers and the communities deal with those issues and overcome and still be successful.
Dr. Jarrod Hardke, thanks for coming in as always. Come back soon.
Thank you for having me again.
And we'll see you next week.
Support for Arkansas Week provided by the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, the Arkansas Times, and KUAR-FM 89.